Well, hello, everyone, and I'm so glad to welcome you all. Following our President Jack Duraki this morning. Thank you, Jack, for those words that you had to say about all that we've accomplished this year. I'm so excited for what CSGS has been able to do, even with COVID-19 going on. This is really set to be an excellent conference, I think, and I'm so excited to just get it kicked off with our first plenary lecturer, Dr. Nirmala Kannankutty. She tells me to call her Nimi. And I've gotten to know her really just by email over this last year. We've corresponded back and forth because she's actually going to be giving a lecture at my institution, the University of Southern Mississippi, as well. And so I'm just delighted that she was also able to participate in this CSGS virtual conference. And let me just introduce her. So Dr. Kannankutty is a senior advisor to the director at the National Science Foundation. She's currently on temporary assignment to this role from her position as the Deputy Division Director in the Division of Graduate Education. This is after spending a year in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. The Division of Graduate Education's mission is to provide funding to support graduate students and the development of novel, innovative programs to prepare tomorrow's leaders in science, technology, engineering, and math. As the deputy, she's provided oversight to over $400 million in annual funding in support of this mission. And as senior executive at NSF, she's provided programmatic, policy, and strategic leadership in multiple NSF organizations. And so prior to her current position, she held leadership and research positions in the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, a federal statistical agency within NSF. She's a national expert on STEM education and the high-skilled workforce in the U.S. Her publications cover science and engineering education, demographic profiles of scientists and engineers, research and development trends, and methodological research on these topics. She trained as a civil engineer at the University of Minnesota, and she then went on to earn a master's in technology and human affairs and a doctorate in engineering and policy from Washington University in St. Louis. And with that, Dr. Kannankutty, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for all those kind words and for the great introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen, so just give me a sec while I do that. Excuse me, it's taking me more than a minute to do this. There we go. I hope everyone can see it. So first, I'd like to thank both CSGS and CHBGS for including NSF in this discussion. My remarks today are a combination of reflections on research I've engaged with, as well as some of the work of the Graduate Education Division at NSF. For the last several years, I've really wanted to be here with you at your meeting. Normally, many of my colleagues would be attending, and I'm so pleased to be here today. I look forward to next year when I hope we can all meet in person. As I was reviewing the program for the conference and participating a little bit yesterday, what struck me about the range of issues you all are going to discuss is that it includes a combination of the ongoing challenges to improving graduate education, but today we address them in the context of the pandemic and how that has highlighted some of these challenges. You know, the graduate education enterprise has a history of using these kinds of situations to improve. For example, about a dozen years ago, there was a drought in Australia. Citizens were asked to conserve water, and one of the ways they did this was by using a 3-minute egg timer when they were showering. The dean of the graduate school of the University of Queensland ran with this thought, and that is how we have the idea of the 3-minute thesis competition. So now we have these legions of young scholars who have learned how to condense their research to present it in a 180-second exposition that would get at the significance of their work to any audience. So what a great innovation that came out of a national adversity. But I will certainly say that I'm very glad to have more than 3 minutes to speak to you today, but I will be mindful of being as succinct as I can. So over the time we have together, I'd like to share with you some observation about the graduate education enterprise and its outcomes. I'd like to share some thoughts about the recent Academy consensus study on graduate education and some of NSF's approach to these recommendations. And finally, I'll end with some thoughts on the current context and how we may learn from it and continue our ongoing efforts to improve graduate education. A perennial trend we look at are career pathways and influences on those pathways. This first slide shows the number and types of positions held by STEM doctorates in our labor force. The key takeaways are not so much the types of positions, but the dramatic growth in the population since 1993. It has almost doubled to over 800,000 employed STEM doctorates in the US labor market. I will note also how the proportion of tenured or tenure track positions has consistently been less than about a third of the position of the population, with a small contraction in the later years. But the key takeaway is that most STEM doctorates are and always have been employed in non-academic positions, and this has been a consistent trend. So the chart on the left shows the employment sector outcomes of doctoral versus master's students proportionally. Blue is the education sector, purple is government, and green is business or industry. We regularly use the term graduate students when referring to doctorates to refer to both master's and doctoral students. Differentiating them, as you all know, is really important, as every year there are almost 10 times as many master's degrees that are awarded in S&E fields relative to doctoral degrees. This is the same chart, but it shows the size of these populations in the labor market. But I think the main takeaway we want to see from this is that how these employment outcomes are very vastly different for doctoral master's students, and so our approaches that we would take when we think about the training models for them should also be different. So this is similar data for very recent doctorates, but it breaks them down by broad discipline. This is another important differentiation because the career pathways are so different. For example, almost 70% of recent doctorates in the social sciences will go into the academic sector, which is one of the highest proportions among all the disciplines. In the computer and information sciences, the opposite is true. 70% will go into the business or industry sector. The training models we're developing, therefore, must adapt to this variety. This chart shows the primary or secondary work activities of recent doctorates by sector. As you can see, basic research, applied research, and development are the most prominent work activities. This tells us that a training model that focuses on research is aligned with career outcomes, most career outcomes. Teaching is important in the education sector, as you can see in that bottom 4 bars. But management activities are another example of a work activity that is important across all sectors. So what these results tell us is that a training model that focuses only on research is not aligned to most career outcomes. So I think what we want to take away from here is that our focus on research is very important, and it certainly aligns with what our graduates will do, but these other kinds of competencies are equally important. I would love to show you more data, but in the interest of time, I won't on other systemic trends. There are these other broader trends, though, that all of you certainly have experienced as leaders in graduate education. I'm just going to list them here, and perhaps later on in our discussion, I'd be happy to address some of these trends during our discussion time. So let me focus a little bit now on the graduate education training model that has been the norm in the US. I'm going to present this to you in the NSF context, but I hope that you'll consider this in your own institutional context as well. So on the right-hand side, we have one of NSF's strategic objectives from our plan. This is the one that is most closely aligned to graduate education, and it's about fostering the growth of a more capable and diverse research workforce, and to advance the scientific and innovation skills of the nation. So the left-hand side of this slide lists characteristics of the traditional model of graduate education. I won't go into all of these, but I think they should be familiar to you. We're trying to combine research and education. There's a significant amount of autonomy for the mentor and the student to craft that educational experience. Lots of importance given to developing disciplinary research expertise. And this certainly also aligns with faculty incentives for research activities. So the product of this model might be referred to as the traditional disciplinary specialist. So if I look at these two sides between the model and the objective, you can see that there's a good deal of an alignment here. However, I think what we know is that successful scientists and engineers should have other competencies that enhance their disciplinary expertise. In this sense, the traditional model is incomplete. That is, the preparation of students must be broader than just the disciplinary expertise, and we need them to be more than disciplinary research specialists. Taking into account all of these trends and understanding that there were persistent concerns about graduate education, NSF funded the National Academies to conduct a consensus study, which was released in 2018. So these are our key takeaways from the report: that US STEM graduate education is still the gold standard, but adaptation is necessary to address a changing scientific research environment. The report has some key features, including themes for improving graduate education, features of an ideal graduate education, and key recommendations by stakeholder group. This slide summarizes the 7 themes for improvement of graduate education. So these themes are actually, and they're pulled from the recommendations that aligned with federal agencies or funding agencies. So these themes are quite broad. So I've kind of organized them into 3 categories that point to different strategies for change. For example, the first 2 themes point to institutional change. That is, how do we, institutional change and educational improvement. So here the questions we're asking is, how do we prepare students who have a broader set of core competencies and who have the education is actually adaptable and flexible for the many kinds of activities that they would be engaged in the future. The next three themes on this list point to improved learning environments. Here, what we are trying to, the recommendations from the report, focus on diversity, equity, and inclusiveness and how we achieve those goals. It recommends ways that we can optimize the student learning experience so that it is aligned to the outcomes that they may experience. And finally, focusing on improved teaching and mentoring. And that is not only teaching of the students, but teaching them also to be good teachers and mentors in the future. And then the last 2 themes are focused on informed decision-making, either by individuals or organizations. And some of that had to do with data transparency regarding the educational experience and opportunities for career exploration for our graduate students. So I propose to align these categories to our strategy for educational goals and focus, so you can see them on the right. So I'd like to describe each in a little bit more detail, but I'll note that this is primarily through the NSF lens. But given that we're a research agency, it won't be surprising to you that some of our focus is on research that will lead to institutional change, educational improvement, and changing the learning environment. On this page, on this slide, you will see the principal research programs that we've got in place that are most relevant for graduate education. I think most of these should be familiar to you. However, I will note that the integration of research and education is a core goal of my agency. In addition to these programs, each of our individual disciplinary research programs also have special opportunities to improve graduate education. I do want to point out a couple of important items on this list. First, the NSF Research Traineeship, the Innovations in Graduate Education, and the Alliances for Graduate Education and the Professoriate are specifically focused on research and model development relevant to graduate education. So I think these core programs are the places where innovation is going to come out on improving graduate education, and we really want to encourage our community to be looking at these programs not only as places to look for funding, but looking for the outcomes of the research funded under these programs, because these are the models that we think will prove most beneficial to your own programmatic development at your institutions. A second point I want to make with regard to this slide is that the NSF Includes program is actively building networks to scale up our activities on broadening participation. To that end, a couple of years ago, we made an alliance award to the Inclusive Graduate Education Network, whose goal will be advancing participation in the graduate pipeline from some disciplines where there's traditionally been underrepresentation of minority groups. So another area we are addressing from the Academy report is on improving data and tools. We are doing this both through changes to NSF's own surveys of graduate students, many of which either your students or your institutions participate in, and we would like to make our improvements to our surveys where we take measurement both before and after students are in their graduate programs. We'd also like to improve our surveys through support of data collection activities, for example, from some of our partners, such as the Council of Graduate Schools. NSF is supporting the CGS Career Pathway Study as well as Master Study on labor market outcomes. We have a long history of supporting CGS in many of its activities, and I know many of you are participating in some of them even as we speak. One award that I think you might be interested in is a national conference on how universities can collect and utilize data on STEM PhD career pathways that was awarded to NORC at the University of Chicago. And that particular workshop really brought together folks from a wide variety of institutions to come up with better, I should say, improved practices for your own institutions to measure your STEM PhD students. I know that many institutions are actively engaged in setting up dashboards and portals to provide information on student career outcomes. This award was to help institutions have some consistency and develop some resources in order to help you do that. A second project we've supported is IRIS at the University of Michigan. The IRIS Center provides an infrastructure for member universities to use their own administrative data to monitor research activities and the careers of researchers. It's also becoming a focal point for researchers to be able to come in and use a lot of data from many institutions to better understand the research and education enterprise. Finally, NSF is also supporting improved data tools to understand graduate enrollments, degrees, and outcomes. I will note that all these improvements in NSF and the support we provide for projects in the community focus on looking at the broad national landscape. They are meant to be used in coordination with the data and tools that you have on your own campuses. So that is an area where there has been a lot of work by CGS and the member institutions, but I think there's really a lot of room for growth. For better coordination, certainly with some of the national tools. And I hope there will be opportunities to engage with all of you in that. And finally, there are a few other activities that are responsive to the consensus study at NSF. The federal government has a STEM education strategic plan, which I hope you're familiar with, and which federal agencies are responding to. I've listed here some of the initiatives that are responsive to that plan at NSF, but I'll note that all the federal agencies are participating in this if they have any STEM related programs. The strategic plan that the government has, there are some public reports about what each of the agencies are doing with regard to the plan. So I'd really encourage you to have a look at that. I'd like to call out one graduate education item on this list entitled Intern. This is an agency-wide funding opportunity at NSF that provides NSF PIs with resources to place their graduate students in internships in non-academic settings. I can tell you that we have had a lot of success with this particular funding opportunity. I'd really encourage your PIs with NSF funding at your institutions to look at this opportunity. It's a great way to get some additional funding to give your graduate students an internship opportunity. And I will say that in some years since we began it, which was in 2017, we haven't really had as much uptake as we'd like to see. So I'd really encourage you to share this opportunity with your community. Similarly, we've got a few other opportunities available that focus on other areas of graduate education. So all the examples of programs here are geared toward improving graduate education, and they provide with NSF, we believe they provide NSF with a good foundation to move forward. However, in developing our future focus, it will be important for NSF to consider the current context and reflect on what we've experienced and learned during the pandemic. So much of what I've gone over today are the long-term trends and the responses that existed well before the pandemic. But this last year has presented us with an external shock and an opportunity to learn about the robustness of our graduate education system. The way we have thought about it internally, and I put that right at the top of the page, is seeing this as crisis as opportunity. We feel that this is an opportunity to accelerate changes that may have previously been held back by inertia, but it also is a time for us to focus on the disparities that were highlighted by the pandemic. While engaging with the community over the last year, these are some of the observations we've consistently heard about. So let me just go over them quickly. We saw that there were many new innovations that emerged, particularly for online learning. But I think our concern here, and certainly all of these concerns were those voiced yesterday in many of the sessions during the conference. So certainly we need to ensure that the innovations do not lead to greater inequality gaps. And certainly we're seeing much of the research that has come out on observations on the pandemic has certainly highlighted some of those disparities. Another area that we've noted is how educators' roles have changed. Certainly you were always there to impart knowledge, but now you must do so in new and more often asynchronous environments. We think about this a lot for perhaps at the K through 12 level or the undergraduate level, but it certainly happens also at the graduate level. One positive note that we've noted is that during the pandemic, STEM workers did relatively well compared to the rest of the population. So we see this as an opportunity to increase interest in STEM. Talking about that financial stability and workforce stability that comes by having a STEM degree. Another thing we noted is how students and those who are employed needed new skills to be resilient and productive. So we were thinking about, well, what kinds of training models do we need to have, and what kinds of lifelong learning opportunities do we need to make available? And this actually gets back to one of the first themes that I had on a couple of slides a few slides ago on adaptability. This is exactly what we're talking about. Another kind of larger transformation that we're seeing is how the value proposition of higher education may have changed. And certainly graduate programs will need to adapt to continue to be seen as valuable. And certainly both from the student perspective as well as from an institutional perspective, which are those programs that are going to be able to adapt themselves to this new environment. We're also expecting to see new models in higher education emerge, particularly if there's any consolidation in the higher education sector, new models for keeping a viable program going. So NSF actually recently funded some very specific projects on the impact of the pandemic on graduate education. I won't go into the details, but I would encourage you to have a look at some of the outcomes. They are instructive on both the nature of the graduate programs and some of the interventions that took place, as well as on the health of our students. And I'll note in the first two awards that I have listed here, the PIs have already published white papers. So the first one is really about, based on a very large scale study, asking universities about some of the impact of the pandemic on their students and what were some of the steps they took for recovery. The second one on the graduate student experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic is also really interesting. This focuses on how the mental health of our students fared during the pandemic, and they used a very interesting trauma model to evaluate students across a wide variety of institutions. So within NSF and the Division of Graduate Education, we started thinking about, well, how would we respond both to the academy study, but also address some of the longer term questions and concerns that we have about improving graduate education. So what I'd like to propose to you are the same framing questions that we're using. These key questions align with the consensus study and with many of the initiatives and the challenges that we think we will face in graduate education. So, the first question is, how can we better employ our research programs to understand the graduate education enterprise? And the goal would be to answer many of the detailed questions, particularly about a student-centered focus for graduate education, as well as on those themes that I had mentioned to you earlier in the talk. The second thing that we are doing is we are looking at our programs. And so we're thinking about, well, how can we really update our research and training programs to modernize graduate education? And the third kind of area that we're focusing on is whether there are policy changes that we can make as stakeholders to better understand the institutional interventions and students that are funded. So for us at NSF, that means, can we really measure what kinds of interventions different students are exposed to, and what kinds of funding are used to fund graduate students? And is there a more optimal way that we can deploy the funding to ensure that they get the interventions that will lead to a successful graduate outcome? And of course, from another way that we think of this at NSF is, how can we support the institutional changes that you would like to put in place to support graduate education modernization? And that one, what I will say is that NSF is a relatively small agency in the federal government. What we're very good at is funding pilots and finding what works. We're less good at, being there to be able to sustain the programs over long periods of time, but we do feel that we can continue to push our research programs to find those good interventions. And finally, the last question that we're considering is, how can the various stakeholders in graduate education improve our outreach and coordination activities with each other? This is where the partnerships come in. That is a major theme for our new director at NSF, our partnerships, and certainly that's what we would like to encourage. So with that, I'll end my remarks, and I'd like to open the floor for questions. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing, but I would be happy to go back to any of the slides if that comes up in any of the questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kannankutty. Really appreciate those remarks. And we do have time now. We've got about 20 minutes or so. We have some questions in this session. And as we mentioned earlier, Dr. Kannankutty will also be one of the breakout sessions where we have a Q&A scheduled for her for others who would like to participate then. So if people will type their questions in the chat, if you have any, that would be great, and we'll be glad to field those. But I'd like to get started. I have a question. I have a couple of things. We're really looking at program revitalization on our campus, and so I've spent a lot of time in the National Academies document that you referred to earlier. And one of the things that we're really concerned about is the issue of improving diversity, equity, and inclusion on our campus in STEM as well as broadly across campus. And I'm wondering if you have any really concrete ideas about how we can be very intentional and really make some progress, which has been difficult?
Mm-hmm. Well, that is a great question. It's a really challenging one to answer because it really depends on the population that you have on your campus. It depends on the types of students that you have, and the kinds of supports that you're able to provide at your institution. So the way that we're trying to share what we've learned, right, is right now my division is in the process of trying to two things that we're doing. First, I mentioned the Includes program that we have, right? And so what the Includes program is doing is pulling together alliances of programs and institutions and researchers together, focused on different populations, so that we can share our experiences and the interventions that may work for a particular population. But the whole idea of the alliance is that anyone can join the alliance. There are all these on-ramps. Every institution can come on board, but there will also be a resource hub for the Includes program to share the best practices to broaden participation. Because I think one of the important things to recognize, particularly, is how interventions that we use could be discipline specific also. Right, there are different populations that are underrepresented in different disciplines. So we really think it's important to target down to those important details, so that we're meeting the students where they are and the needs that they have. A second activity that we're engaged in is we are developing a resource network on improving graduate education. So you can imagine that you want to overlay the interventions for improving graduate education while also looking at what are the interventions that are going to work for broadening participation. These are I didn't show the data because I think many of you are familiar with this, but we've made improvements in broadening participation of underrepresented groups in STEM. But it has nowhere been close to the rapid growth of those populations in the general population, right? We just haven't made the progress that we'd like to make, and in some disciplines we've actually kind of topped out, right? I mean, we had some improvements, and then it's steady. This is a real focus for NSF right now. And so I think we're at the beginning of a very large shift in how we think about broadening participation. Includes as our kind of leading edge in terms of how we're doing that. So I would really encourage all of you to look at the resources that are available through Includes, and I'd be happy to follow up with any of you, offline on particular challenges you may have or resources we may have for particular disciplines and so on. I will mention that the one award I mentioned, the iGen Award, which is an Includes Alliance focused on graduate education. That team has done a fantastic job of standing up a website and talking about resources. They have monthly talks. They have all kinds of resources that are available. And I think that's an example of a nice award that we made that crosses over into something that's very specific for graduate education. Because I think a lot of the research and interventions that we have out there often focus on undergraduate students, and we have a very different population at the graduate level and different pressures and concerns. And so I think the focus that group of PIs has on graduate students in particular is really great. And I will mention also that award, it's a partnership between some education researchers and professional societies, right? So we've got professional societies in physics and chemistry, and so they're looking, from a disciplinary perspective, but they're also thinking about their members and what their members are worried about, and thinking about preparing students not just for the academic careers that they may have, but for the non-academic careers. years. So I think it's really important for folks to look at that. And I see someone in the chat has put up the Includes Network, so really happy to see that. And if I get a chance, I will also post the link to the iGen program as well.
I wonder if you could speak to the value of individual development plans, and I know NSF requires them. Many of the federal agencies are requiring them with grant applications. Can you just speak to the use of those?
Yeah, so NSF doesn't require it, across the board for all of our programs, but that certainly was a recommendation in the consensus study, and other agencies have used the individual development plans. So I will tell you that our experience is informed by the fact that more than several years ago, we started requiring postdoc development plans, right? So that is a requirement if you're requesting funding for a postdoc. So we wanted to try to learn from that to see, what impact did that have, and how should we roll it out for graduate students? Because we're always trying to balance the burden we may put on our PIs for the research grants, but we also didn't want to kind of step out in front of institutions. We feel that the institutions are in the place to provide the best education to the students, and they're providing that day-to-day, face-to-face activity. And so we didn't want to step out in front of the institutions either. And so one of the things that we've learned from all of these experiences, and I will say that we are rolling out IDPs in certain of our programs, and in our Innovations in Graduate Education research program, we're actually funded some research on the impact of using a IDP. Because we really want to make sure that, if we are going to roll something out more broadly, we'd want to make sure that the program that we roll out has the appropriate features. So one of the things we learned from the postdoc development plan that we've put in place is that having the requirement in place itself, and the fact that it requires conversations between the individual and their mentor, that in itself had a tremendous value, right? We knew that just having, even if it wasn't a very expansive plan, just the fact that it was in place, that in and of itself caused some conversations to happen, or even just thinking about what the current context for what those postdocs were doing and how that relates to their future outcomes. Those were often conversations that were simply not even happening. So I think, in that sense, we think IDPs are very good because it fosters that kind of discussion. But we're still thinking, we haven't rolled it out. And we're trying to be very careful about how we would roll something like this out. And of course, you can imagine there are differing perspectives and different disciplines about the value of it. And so these are all the things that we're considering. We absolutely would never discourage it, and we would encourage our PIs to use whatever techniques their institutions or they think would best support the professional development of their students.
Great. Yeah, and I use those in a professional development program that I have, and I've had great feedback of students thinking that it just, the self-reflection, strengths and weaknesses, and sort of how to get to their long-term goals by, shoring up their weaknesses and emphasizing their strengths has been just eye-opening to them in many cases, to just things they haven't thought about before. I think there's a lot of value in that.
So I see a question in the chat about dashboards for career outcomes and whether there are any models available. Actually, there are some great models out there. CGS has actually helped a lot of institutions think about this, and Suzanne Ortega was actually on the Academy consensus study that recommended putting some of this data out there. So I would be happy to show you one if you have just a moment, and I will show that to you. But there are many institutions that have done a great job of this. Duke University is actually a great, has done a great job of looking at their graduate students and what they ended up doing out in the labor market. So I am going to post something, and I'm going to post here the URL. And this is actually a dashboard that was developed by the National Science Board at NSF. But I often use it as an example of the kind of dashboard that folks might want to think about at their own institutions. And I'm going to share my screen as well. So I hope you can see this. So this is based on national data that was some of the data that I talked about earlier. This is NSF's data that we collect on doctorates in the workforce. And what this infographic does, and I'm just going to pick a particular, pick a particular discipline. I'm going to pick computer and information sciences. So you can see I've got doctorates in computer and information sciences in the workforce in 2013. And if I scroll down, you can see that the the major cut that we have of all the doctorates is how many years out of their doctorate they are. So it goes from 1 to 4, 5 to 9, all the way down to 15 plus years. And I'm just going to focus on the top of the screen. So what you can see here is that the proportion of doctorates working in each sector of the economy. And then I can pull this screen down and I can look at, for example, gender. So I can see, what the gender breakdown looks like of male versus female in each sector. And then we can look at race, ethnicity, and you can see what that looks like within each sector. And I'm going to just pull up another discipline that's likely very different. I'm going to pull up economics, and you can see that that's very heavily weighted toward the education sector and very different demographic profiles. And I'll just maybe pull down one more. And this goes to some of the data that I showed you earlier on folks' work activities. So anyway, this is an example of a kind of I'm sorry, let me just close that off. Not quite sure how to turn off my screen share, but there we go. So that's an example of a kind of dashboard that we've developed for a national data set. And so we often encourage universities to think about, if you look at the national data, that's kind of the benchmark for a discipline across the country, and then thinking about what would be important for your own institution. I think CGS has done a great job of this as well. They've got some tools and resources available, and as well as, I think it's important to think about what your own students want to know. I think that the students, the institutions that are able to provide the best information about their student outcomes, they're the ones who are going to be the most competitive in the future. I mean, many of your graduate schools already do this for certain disciplines, right? So for medicine, for business, for law, there are typically really good metrics, better than, say, for STEM, on career outcomes. And so I think having this kind of information, working with your students to really understand what they would like to know, because I think a lot of students are not really clear on what their opportunities might be in the future, and looking at previous graduates is a great way to do that.
Great.
And I just want to follow up to Sharon, who asked that question. If you get in touch with me separately, I'd be happy to give you some additional examples of some dashboards that are out there.
Oh, that's outstanding. Does anybody else have a question you want to type in the chat? Please feel free to do so. I do have a question I'd like to ask. And again, as we're working on our revitalization efforts on my campus, one of the things we want to address is core competencies. And, you know, what should those look like? I obviously going to vary from discipline to discipline. What are your thoughts on that?
Actually, I am going to show you, I've thought about this a lot, and I'd like to share with you some of my backup slides that I have that address this in particular. So let me pull that back up. Okay. Okay, so this is what we call the pie-shaped professional, right? And you may have seen this before. This is a model that we've used as a goal for graduate student competencies through some of the programs in my division. So the first vertical bar of this pie represents kind of the deep disciplinary knowledge that is kind of the foundation of STEM training. The second vertical bar represents computational skills that are increasingly becoming a universal competency across many disciplines. And then the horizontal bar of the pie represents the additional competencies that we feel will support NSF's goal of producing scientists and engineers with broad transferable skills. So you can see some of the competencies that are there, you know, teamwork, communication, teaching, leadership, entrepreneurship. We could add lots of other things too, right? And then across that is what I'm going to call exterdisciplinary training, and I will share what that means in just a moment. So this is a great conceptual model, right? So it's got these strong foundation plus these cross-cutting competencies. But I'd like to share something that has maybe just a little bit more depth. So this is a researcher development framework that was developed in the United Kingdom. And it's a comprehensive list of lifelong competencies that researchers would need to have. And I came across this many years ago. I've worked with the organization in the UK that developed this framework. So the framework is a result of years of research, about 25 years of research. And if you look closely at this framework, what you can see is that there are four main areas of focus. The first is knowledge on intellectual abilities, and this is, I think, what we pretty much are familiar with in terms of training disciplinary scientists, right? And it's very specific. The particular, the knowledge base, the cognitive abilities are very focused on, the discipline. The second area and the second domain area is about personal effectiveness, right? And so this gets at things like professional and career development and the kinds of things one would need to do over your career to improve yourself as a researcher. It has to do with self-management. You know, how do you manage your time? How do you respond to change? How do you have that work-life balance? And then the personal qualities, right, that you'd want to have and that an individual needs to develop, so integrity, self-confidence. So, that's another domain. A third domain is research, governance, and organization. And this really has to do with how do you set yourself up as a research professional and manage your research program, right? So that's where we get into things like ethics or legal strategies or research strategies, or how do you actually ensure that you have steady funding for your research? Another domain. And finally, the last domain is engagement, influence, and impact. And this is another set of competencies that speak to how effective you are as a researcher, right? So this is working with others, how you communicate, so on and so forth. What I love about this research development framework is, it can be adapted to the needs of a particular discipline. Another piece of the framework, which isn't evident just from this diagram, is that these skills that we're talking about, these competencies, these are not competencies that you just kind of develop and you have them, through a graduate program. These are lifelong competencies. there's a different level of skill that you would need to develop over the course of your career till you really fully develop a particular competency. And this researcher development framework actually has a nice framing for how one might think about developing these competencies over the course of your career. So, you know, in a nutshell, I would say I found this to be the most comprehensive set of you know, competency list that I've seen for researchers. And you know, we really like the pie-shaped professional, that framing, because it's simple and easy to understand. But this other framework, you know, this other framework I think is much richer. And one thing about the framework that was developed, if you actually go to their website, and they have a great website, you can actually see some of the research that led to these programs. And what they're doing in the UK is, in order to develop these competencies, I mean, it takes an intervention, it takes a program, it takes, you know, something, right, to help develop these competencies. And so what Vitae is doing is helping universities put in place programs to both deliver those competency training opportunities for the students. Another thing that they're doing is, you know, doing an assessment afterwards to see if that training worked. So I can give you an example of one thing that they've done in the UK that I don't think we have anything like this here. So certainly in STEM fields, particularly in some STEM fields, the patenting process and putting forward like an invention disclosure or something like that is a critical part of the research training that a student may be involved in, right? And they themselves, as young researchers, may be developing intellectual content that is theirs. And so one of the things that happened in the UK is, similar to our patent and trademark office, they also have a national patent and trademark office, and I'm forgetting what it's called at this moment, but they have that. So what they did is they worked with that organization to develop training modules for graduate students that would show them how to protect their own intellectual property that they are developing as part of their graduate training. It doesn't have to be something that's patented, but it could still be anything that they develop, and how do they protect themselves and gain the appropriate credit for the work that they're doing. So that's a training module that graduate students across the UK can participate in to learn that very important competency. So that's an example of the kind of thing that happens, that has happened in the UK.
Dr. Kannankutty, I'm going to cut you off because we're running out of time. There were numerous references or questions in the chat, comments in the chat about wanting to see these slides, if you can share your slides.
Absolutely.
As well as these backup slides that you provided. There was just a lot of information in those. So everybody will have that opportunity to see that.
So yes, please. So I'm going to just type my, my email address in the chat. So you have that. I believe the slides are going to be posted. Julie can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd be happy to, if you reach out to me, I'd be happy to send you my slides too.
Well, we really appreciate it. It's an exceptional and a really informative presentation. And I know those who will be joining you in the Q&A will have a lot more questions to ask. So
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. For everybody who's viewing right now, just want to remind you to move over into the Sessions tab. And 5 minutes before the presentation, you will be able to click on that and enter it. So I hope everybody will just continue on with the conference. And thanks so much for a wonderful start, Dr. Kannankutty.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.